this, I believe. Yes, so here the recording started. And as a way of introduction, I want to recall that my name is Jos van Oosthoven. I'm one of the co-organizers of the webinar series and also of the forum ICA is organizing next week, where apart from One Health, also artificial intelligence in research and education in life sciences will be addressed. And next week during that forum, a synthesis, a summary of the three webinars, the one on the human perspective, the one on the animal perspective, and the one on today's environmental perspective will be communicated to the participants of the forum. So I will introduce our speaker, but first ask you to keep your microphones muted. Probably the best is also to keep the cameras off. Of course, you may have questions which pop up during the webinar. Please post your questions in the chat. After the presentation, I will, depending on how many questions there are, I will make a selection of these questions and propose them to our speaker to reply. Raf told me that if there would be questions which cannot be addressed during the webinar within the 1 hour time frame we have available, that he remains ready to address these questions through email. Okay, so my pleasure is to introduce Dr. Part-time Professor Raf Aerts. Raf is connected to two institutions. First and foremost, he's an environmental epidemiologist at Cienzano, and Cienzano is the Belgian One Health Institute. Simultaneously, Raf is a part-time professor in biodiversity and health at the biology department of the University of Leuven here in Belgium. So from these two backgrounds, Raf will talk about healthy environment from the One Health perspective. And he made us curious by stating in his abstract that he will describe 7 aspects that define a healthy environment for plants, animals, and people. So I'm very much looking forward to Raf's presentation. I'm sure you also are looking forward to that. Thank you. Please, Raf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jos, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. Let me see how I can proceed here. Okay, there we go. Right. So my name is Raf Aerts. I'm a forest ecologist by training, but I have gradually evolved into a broader environmental scientist and even environmental epidemiologist since I started working for Cienzano, which is the former Institute of Public Health and now the One Health Institute of Belgium. It's not surprising that in that context, I adopt a One Health approach in my research, and my research aims to support human health and biodiversity conservation. So what I do is I study how green space and biodiversity in terms of quantity, quality, species composition, and so on, has different impacts on several aspects of human health. In that type of research, we of course always take into account other exposures, environmental exposures such as air pollution or heat, but also important socio-economic drivers of human health and quality of life. What we typically do is to first inform our public health service of the associations that we find, but we also collaborate with urban planners to convert our gained knowledge into actions in the field. And this ultimately may lead to improved conservation of biodiversity where we live in our cities, but also in the surrounding area. So that's my framework, my work field. And this explains why I work both in the Human Health Institute and in the biology department of the Leuven University. Let me first state the problem. If we look at cities in Europe, we must observe that 97% of the population living in cities in Europe is exposed to dangerous levels of air pollution. That's not a good thing. 20% of that population also lives in areas where noise levels are harmful to health. Again, that's not very good. And in the period between 2030 and 2060, there is a 100% expected increase in heatwave days in Europe, and that is certainly also not a good sign. So our cities in Europe face environmental stress, and environmental stress may result in an unhealthy environment, and this, of course, can affect both mental and physical health of people. So these numbers are not my own. These are from the EU Committee of Regions in their opinion on the European Green Deal and health. So today's talk is on healthy environments from the One Health perspective. I will make it a bit more precise. We'll talk about 7 aspects that define a healthy environment from the One Health perspective, in my opinion. So even if I have had my talk reviewed by 2 colleagues here at Cienzano, the opinion is my own and does not necessarily reflect the official point of view of Cienzano or KU Leuven. Let me start with position number 1. A healthy environment from a One Health perspective requires biodiversity and healthy ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems have a critical role in supporting human and animal well-being through ecosystem services. I think we can all agree that since the publication of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, we are very well aware that biodiversity or life on Earth is indeed the driver of these ecosystem services. It's not the ecosystems themselves, but the species living in these ecosystems that are responsible for these ecosystem services. Unfortunately, deforestation and also other forms of habitat loss, in combination with climate change and the introduction of invasive species, result in species losses. And species losses result in a disruption of ecosystem services with detrimental impacts on both human and animal populations and, of course, their health. What was not reported in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is that there are certain invisible species losses, and I mean specifically soil and other environmental microbiota, that such losses can contribute to dysbiosis, a loss of connection with microbial diversity, with adverse physical and mental health effects through impacts on the human microbiome. So as a summary for the first position, a healthy environment requires conservation of biodiversity, and more we also need restoration of biodiversity, and not only the visible species, but also microbiomes. A healthy environment from a One Health perspective requires the prevention of spillovers of zoonotic diseases. So the biodiversity that I highlighted in the first aspect also includes wild animals, and such animals can play a role as a reservoir or a vector or an amplifier for certain infectious diseases. And these diseases can be transmitted to other wild animals, but also domesticated animals, and of course also humans. COVID-19, but also Ebola, and then West Nile virus, and at present the very pathogenic avian influenza are very notorious examples of such infectious diseases. Therefore, a healthy environment is an environment where the exposure of people and potential spillover events are avoided. Bushmeat and illegal pet trade, as well as the encroachment of wild habitats of wild animals, clearly pose threats to this healthy environment. As a result, a healthy environment from a One Health perspective also requires monitoring of vector-borne diseases. So infectious diseases can occur in several ways, in seasonal cycles, for instance, but also in local epidemic outbreaks. And we've all experienced another form, pandemics, in wild animals, domestic animals, and humans. At present, unfortunately, disease ecology is often studied only after the spillover event, and that's problematic. There are certain changes in the climate, and that's global climate, but also regional and local climate, and changes in habitat species composition and in species distribution that are often linked to human activities, such as intensive poultry farming, that affect the spread and distribution of such diseases. For instance, birds very efficiently spread pathogens and even antimicrobial resistance genes around the world. A news article in one of the latest issues of Science, in a special issue on heat and health, reported that climate change is reshaping the journeys of migratory birds, and therefore also reshaping the spread of bird-mediated diseases. Similarly, warming has been demonstrated to favor the mosquito that spreads dengue fever, and this fuels a global search of this very important disease. Therefore, a healthy environment also requires coordinated efforts to predict, detect, and track emerging infectious diseases and antimicrobial resistance. And this is to enable evidence-based early warning systems and also risk assessment of emerging infectious diseases. But it's not only diseases that define an unhealthy or a healthy environment. A healthy environment from a One Health perspective resists natural disasters and has people who are prepared to respond. Natural disasters include earthquakes and hurricanes, floods, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and also wildfires. The Hurricane Katrina in the USA in 2005 is an example. In Belgium, we had devastating floods in 2021. And this year, there were very severe wildfires in Canada. And those are only 3 examples of very many more. Such natural disasters can have natural underlying causes, but the impacts of natural disasters can be exacerbated by human factors, such as poor forest management, or poor stormwater management, to name a few. And these environmental impacts of natural disasters often have cascading effects on human and animal health. For instance, floods caused by hurricanes or exceptional storms could facilitate the spread of pathogens, antimicrobial resistance genes, or waterborne disease by dispersing sewage or manure into the environment. On the other hand, volcanic eruptions and wildfires have severe impacts on the air quality, and the air quality was already not optimal in cities. And this may lead to even higher incidences of cardiovascular and respiratory disease and even mortality. So a healthy environment can and must resist and survive natural threats, even extreme ones. For instance, by being diverse in terms of species, in terms of structures, and in terms of functions. But there is an important social dimension too. The society should be prepared to respond, for instance, through integrated disaster management that consider health and welfare of both human and animals during, but importantly also after such extreme events. As a fifth point, I want to mention that a healthy environment also requires a healthy food system. Healthy agricultural systems are crucial to human and environmental health. These systems are in fact more complex than it would seem because they are defined by many factors, including soil health, but also animal health, and of course also plant health. Even human nutritional values are important, and also the economical context defines the state of the agricultural system. Unfortunately, there are many problems in our Western agricultural system. For instance, the overuse of antibiotics in poultry farms and other systems, in livestock, for instance, lead to antimicrobial resistance, which is a real global problem. Also, intensive farming degrades soil and water. It contributes to air pollution and the nitrogen problem, and it leads to biodiversity losses due to intensification of agriculture and eutrophication of the environment. Due to intensive agriculture now and in the past, virtually every person in the world is exposed to pesticides and pesticide residues on a daily basis. And this via the environmental exposure, but even through food contamination. Therefore, a healthy environment requires a healthier agricultural system. Connecting to that, I want to come to point 6, which states that a healthy environment requires efforts to minimize our exposure to persistent pollutants. I already explained in point 5 that contaminants from agriculture can enter our food system, but also contaminants from the industry and chemical pollutants such as PFAS or even flame retardants from various other sources such as your ICA furniture or cardboard boxes can enter the food chain and affect ecosystems with consequences for human and animal populations. In a study that we performed in collaboration with the World Health Organization, we found that organic pollutants, persistent organic pollutants or POPs, including the metabolites of and degradation products of banned pesticides such as DDT are still present in the environment and are even transferred across generations via breast milk. So mother is exposed and will expose her child through breastfeeding. So in a healthy environment, we should minimize this exposure by cleaning up contaminated areas, by reducing the use of potentially harmful chemicals as much as possible, and by replacing them with safer alternatives. And finally, and this is the statement that is most close to my own expertise, a healthy environment from a One Health perspective is a green environment. So in a healthy environment, we are exposed to visual, functional, and accessible green space in 3 different ways. So playing in a garden, for instance, or in a park or in a forest, is exposure with direct contact with nature and biodiversity. If you live in a green environment, or if you have a view on green through your office window, a tree or a meadow or something else that is green, you have exposure to biodiversity without direct contact. And experiencing nature or feeling connected to nature is a third way. It's mental exposure to green space. And these 3 pathways of exposure have been connected to 3 pathways of improved human health and well-being. In the first place, green space and nature. Green space is nature or man-made nature. Anything that is green in our environment can build capacities. For instance, by promoting physical activity, or by enhancing social contacts, or by improving the immune system, especially in early life. Green space has also the ability to restore capacities. For instance, by reducing stress or by restoring attention. It has been demonstrated that exposure to green space reduces our effort to understand things, and this helps our mind to reset. And stress reduction, we know all that stress is bad. Stress reduction leads to improved well-being and health. And finally, green spaces provide the ecosystem services, as I explained in point number 1, that reduce our exposure to environmental stress factors such as heat, noise, and air pollution. But also, ecosystems provide food and water that are connected to improved health. Therefore, the positive effects of exposure to green space include improved perceived and measured health, improved cognitive functioning, lower medication sales for several diseases and illnesses, and lower risks for depression, stress, and even mortality. So to conclude, a healthy environment from a One Health perspective is a green environment. And if I have to sum up all points from 1 to 7, I could say a healthy environment from a One Health perspective is clean and green. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Raf, for your very structured overview. 7 different aspects of what a healthy environment can be or is. I have not found so far questions in the chat, but of course, you attendees, you remain very welcome to post in the next few minutes questions. Maybe I can start off by asking a question, a very general one. So your final conclusion is a healthy environment is clean and green. But it looks like you encourage people to escape from the cities, which are less clean and less green than the rural environment. Is that a correct interpretation?
No, not at all. In the first place, the rural environment is not necessarily cleaner. In a rural environment, your exposure to pesticide residues will probably be higher. Also, I do not encourage people to leave the cities, but rather, and that's what I demonstrated in my first slide, I would like policymakers, including urban planners, to make our cities greener. In several research projects that we have carried out at KU Leuven and Cienzano, we even found that the effects of green space on human health are larger in urban areas than in rural areas, because there is some kind of saturation effect that results in more benefits from green within an urban environment than from additional green in an already green environment.
Well, I believe that's a very clear answer to my a bit provocative question, of course. I don't find questions in the chat. Probably it means that your presentation was very clear and well structured, as already said. Maybe as a last attempt from my side to give attendees the possibility to still post a question. A healthy environment is clean and green, and that is possible, as you say, within cities. So how do you relate that to statement 2 and 3, where you emphasize actually diseases, vector-borne diseases, but including animal diseases? How do those two statements fit in this overall concluding statement you make?
Yes, for that I must go back to this slide. If you go to the original publication by Melissa Marcel, published in Environment International, you'll notice that there is actually a fourth box in this figure. Under reducing harm is a fourth box causing harm. We have to realize that by greening our cities, we could increase the possibility for transmission of certain diseases, especially vector-borne diseases. And this is something that's not only present in tropical regions where we think about all kinds of mosquitoes living in ponds and transmitting malaria. Our colleagues at the Rega Institute in KU Leuven have recently documented and published the fact that our indigenous mosquito species are competent hosts for West Nile virus, which is a virus that is novel in our Western European area. So yes, green space is good for health, especially when it's clean and green. But we have to realize that this green space, which also includes blue spaces, may also entail some risks. And therefore, I stated in my point number 3 that we need to monitor such vector-borne diseases very closely.
Thank you, Ralph. We have a question in the chat about the health benefits from exposure to agricultural green space in comparison to exposure to a forest and the blue space. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I know I was a bit harsh on the agricultural systems in one of my slides, but indeed we also find evidence that agricultural green space can have beneficial effects on human health. For instance, because you are not exposed to the typical urban stress factors in an agricultural environment, and that's typically noise from traffic, noise from airplane, noise from just human activities. And we also have to realize that there are certain agricultural systems which are aesthetically very pleasing. Think about apple orchards, fruit orchards, or the small bocage landscapes in the North France or Wallonia. They can even have a high biodiversity value. So when I say that green space is mainly forests and so on, well, agriculture also has the potential to deliver benefits to human health.
Thank you. Well, I believe that we can close here.
Josh,
Yes.
from Lisa. Lisa put her hand up.
I don't see your hand. Sorry.
Oh, it's gone. It's gone. Is it? Yeah. Lisa? Okay.
Yes. If there would be somebody having an immediate question and prefers to ask that one orally, it's possible in the next few seconds. If not, well, there is another question in the chat. Yaf, you can read it. Do you believe that the new trend in virtual reality experience could be beneficial? Virtual exposure to green space.
Yes, sure. And it has been documented in several publications that even virtual exposure to green space can have stress-reducing properties. It's a repetition of the famous paper that was one of the first that documented beneficial effects of green space in a hospital environment. And I'm quite convinced because I've
Raf, you have muted yourself, I believe.
Okay. So yes, I just can conclude that indeed virtual exposure is helpful too, and that it has been already applied in experimental studies, but also in occupational settings. If you go to our student restaurant in Leuven, for instance, you'll see these big posters of natural landscapes, and yeah, this is a direct result of these studies on virtual exposure.
Thank you, Raf. Alessia
Yes.
you want to ask a question orally,
Yeah.
please.
Sorry, it's just because I'm experiencing a network on a difficult connection. So I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
So my question is that yesterday, our colleague from the European agency EFSA, at one point he was mentioning the joint efforts to implement more this approach One Health. And he was reminding that the momentum is usually coming from the veterinary and the public health communities. And then he said, I quote, environment is lagging behind. And in this country, in France, we are experiencing sometimes struggles between the position of, for example, the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture, because pushing towards all what you said is not always in favor of the national agricultural sector. So I was wondering, what is your point of view from the country where you work, and if in other countries this coordination between all the players of the ecosystem health in the One Health approach, it's easier if there are best practices that we can learn from. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for your question. Maybe you should mute your microphone because I hear an echo.
Maybe someone can mute it for me. Yeah,
I did, yes.
Okay.
So okay, it's indeed a very tricky question actually, and I can illustrate it with the nitrogen deposition problem in Belgium, where we have at one hand the minister of that is responsible for nature conservation says that certain agricultural industries must either reduce their emissions or close when they are located near natural reserves, whereas the minister responsible for agriculture then says, but no, we're not going to say that these farmers must stop their activities because they have an environmental permit to do whatever they do, for instance, breeding pigs or cattle next to a large heathland. And even the agreement on nitrogen, which was first passed and then again halted, I don't know where that's going. It illustrates that it is a very complex matter. And even if we from the health side say we must reduce nitrogen because the demonstrated disadvantages of nitrogen in the air are very well documented. And if we say from the biodiversity conservation side, yes, we must stop nitrogen deposition because it really is deteriorating the biodiversity in our natural areas. It seems that whatever we tell from what side, it is not resulting in real actions for the moment.
Thank you, Raf. Alessia, is this an answer to your question? Well, we don't hear you, but I suppose that it is. Thank you, Raf. So I believe we can close here our webinar and at the same time close the webinar series we have conducted over the last 3 years. I want to thank Raf, of course, but also the two other speakers, Stefan Bronswaer on Monday and yesterday Annemarie Rebel. We will take what we learned in these 3 webinars further into the ICA forum of next week. And it is possible that some position statements will be formulated based on what we learned and what we will discuss. So I want to thank you all. I hope you have enjoyed and learned from these webinars and hope to encounter you in the One Health arena in the near future. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.